Creative Ideas, latest techniques project. Oh, we're on air. That was a shock. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Game Audio Hour 107.
Ooh.
Last week I said that it was 106 was a little bit like a Roland number, but not quite. But actually, somebody in the chat room very rightly pointed out the classic Juno 106.
Juno 107. Mm-hmm.
Now, the 107, that is not a Roland number. Anything with a 7 in it, except for the TR-707, is kind of more Yamaha, I think, somehow, like the SY-77 or the... Anyway, I digress. Welcome to our weekly podcast where we discuss all things game audio. I'm trying very hard to remember this. Here we go. From creative... No, I'm looking up here. You can see me. I'm creative ideas to the latest techniques, project secrets to... No, project experiences, audio secrets. Here's where you'll find everything you ever wanted to know about the wonderful field that we work in, which is game audio. Today, we are sadly missing the charismatic presence of Michael Shapiro. And as for Kyle Johnson, who is actually in his second week away from the Game Audio Hour, you might be wondering what is happening to Kyle Johnson. Well, I can tell you, he is actually he's on a US-wide stadium rock gig. Am I right? Tonight he's playing somewhere in front of thousands and thousands of people, being the rock god that he is. You know, people are just like pumping their fists as he's like rips into that E power chord. So instead of E power chords, we have Vince. Vince is indeed the human equivalent of the E power chord. How are you, Vince?
I'm doing okay. I don't know if I'm an E power chord. I always thought of myself as one of those, 11 sharp 4 chords, something kind of interesting,
kind of fruity.
Yeah, I'm very dominant Lydian, I would say. I'm a very dominant Lydian kind of guy. Doing pretty well, despite I guess those sharp 4s. Yeah, it's fun times over here. How about over there in Japan?
It's a dark day today. We are right in the middle of the monsoon, which means it's not that hot, but it's like 5 billion% humidity. So through the show, I have all the windows open, so you might hear the sound of construction and trains and stuff in the background. But through the show, you may see me starting to get progressively more and more sweaty. That is simply because of the Northeast Asian humidity, famed humidity. It's a wonderful thing. I think maybe there's a way to actually extract drinking water from humidity in the air. That way we could send some of the stuff down to you guys because you need the water down there, don't you? How's that going?
Yeah, we do. It's still pretty dry, although there have been some interesting news reports about how, at least in some local communities, we've been building up our water reserves. So it's actually sort of promising news here in California.
That's good.
But hey, the more water we can get, the better. It's a multi-year thing where we got a lot to work on.
Coming from Adelaide in Australia, which is Australia's driest city, and Australia is the driest country in the world, I know exactly what it is to be in drought. But I'm not in Adelaide today. I'm in Osaka in Japan. So let's have a quick hello to all of our wonderful people in the chat room who are watching at the moment. Hi, guys. Great to have you here as always. Today, Vince and I have got a bevy of fine topics for your enjoyment. We actually have one sort of slightly hardware-ish kind of software-ish topic, and then the rest is sort of philosophical, kind of bullshitty, pretentious, arty-farty kind of stuff that we're really good at talking about, and that's why you're watching. So, firstly, we'll go through the software topic first. We're gonna just talk a little bit about DAWs. Now, regular viewers of the show will know that we try not to do this too often because how interesting can a DAW really be? Yeah, it's only just the central hub of everything that we do, and it's remotely audio related in our field. But we don't want to bore too many people. I'm curious about the situation with Logic Pro X. It's interesting that every time they do a bug fix release, there's just pages and pages and pages of bugs. Now, not being an expert on software engineering, I do know that the more complicated a piece of software becomes, and the more people who work on it, these two things would generally lead to an increased risk of software instability as coders add new features. Other coders may not be, completely familiar with how what happens when they make changes, whether that will affect other people's features. And the more programmers you get, the more difficult that all generally becomes. That said, I have to say, Logic Pro X, it baffles me how unstable it is. Now, I'm not sure if it's just me, because people use it every day. Mike Shapiro uses it. Plenty of our fantastic peers in game audio use it for audio and also for sound effects production as well. And it's such fantastic value for money. Really, it's probably out of all the DAWs out there, it's probably the best value for money. I would argue, just the amount of stuff that you get with it. Extremely high quality plugins, virtual instruments, and a decent sample library that comes with it too. And it can do scoring, and it can do advanced MIDI work, and it can do great live recording, and all around it's just a great package. But how come it is so unstable? Case in point, last month I tried to do a project in Logic Pro. I had one crash, about 3 weird bugs. Weird bugs meaning things that just sort of make you scratch your head. For example, if you change your process buffer, I don't know if I can reproduce this, but if you change the processing buffer from, say, 256 to 64 or something because you want to play with less latency because you're going to record something, if you have an EXS24 plugin open with a whole setup of samples arranged in there, it will, if you change the processing buffer, the EXS24 plugin will reset itself to all default sine waves. If you had saved your EXS patch, then for whatever reason, after you've changed the processing buffer, you go back into the EXS, you find it's all sine waves, you're pulling your hair out thinking, where did my immaculate layout of samples go? You try and reload the patch that you save, and for whatever reason, in the file window, files are grayed out. So there's no way to reload what I just saved. The only way to do is to save, quit out of the thing, and then restart again, and now I can load them. That's a bug.
That sounds like a pretty bad bug.
Number 2, if you have, you have a clip, a MIDI clip, and then you have an alias for that clip. So you whatever changes you do in this one will affect this one. Now, I found that which way around was it? I'm probably going to say this wrong, so people will immediately prove me wrong by going out and trying this. But if you drag a note in this one, and it has an alias, normally you'd expect that note's change to be sort of replicated along all the aliases. Instead, this note just disappears. Like you drag it, you let go, and it disappears. How do people use this? I mean, those 2. There's another one. Oh yeah, if you press Command 2, I think it will bring up the mixer window. So if you don't want to have the mixer panel, like a tray at the bottom, and you want to have it in a separate window because you use 2 monitors, then you would have a window. If you go then and customize what you want to see in that mixer window, I don't want to see the compression meter because I use my own compressors. I don't want to see the EQ thumbnail because I use my own EQs. So I'm going to turn those off. I don't want to see the icon because who cares about icons? I want to turn all of those off. Then you happen to close the mixer window, but then you want to check your mix again, so you open it again. None of your customizations have stuck. So that's all back to default again. So I don't understand. I mean, it's usable. Oh, not to mention the crashes, which are sort of very non-OS friendly crashes in the Logic Pro. When it crashes, the whole thing just disappears. It's not like it comes up with a little thing that says, Logic Pro has crashed. Would you like to send a report to Apple? It just completely disappears as if you just hit quit. It's like the process just vanishes. And that will happen at fairly inconvenient times. Fortunately, to Logic's credit, if you open it again, it'll say, auto-saved version because Logic had quit unexpectedly. That's great. But don't crash. So actually, the reason I'm thinking about this is because yesterday I was at Vitae using Renoise on Windows, and Renoise actually crashed. And that was really shocking for me because in the, 6 or 7 years that I've been using Renoise every day professionally, it has crashed a total of, this is the 3rd time that it's crashed ever. And
Wow.
to its credit, when it crashes, it's only the ASIO sound driver that's crashed. Renoise itself is fine, so I can still save and still exit Renoise without problem. But just the sound, the ASIO crashed, which means that I couldn't hear anything, and everything was frozen. So I was really shocked. Oh wow, it crashed. Then every time I go into Logic, I'm finding these odd sort of debilitating bugs. So, I mean, what's going on?
Man, software has bugs. There's always, I mean, with the software that I have, there's always bugs. Even the best software has bugs, but it's all a matter of what are the bugs that you can live with and what are the bugs that you just can't live with.
Mm.
I've actually been a SoundForge guy for years, and I think most people who've used it extensively know that it is a buggy piece of software. But thankfully, the vast majority of those bugs are bugs that you can live with. Um, as an example, there is a really important function, exporting regions. Okay, I've got a big WAV file. I'm going to set up my markers and regions, and I'm going to export those regions. This bug has been there since SoundForge 8, 9, 10, and 11, the current one. If you hit enter on that dialog box, you will not get any exported regions. However, if you use the mouse to click on the OK button, you will get your exported regions. It's just, why won't they fix it? I'm really annoyed at them that they won't fix it. But on the other hand, I'm happy that it at least works. And I've now remember, okay, for that dialog box, I'm going to move my mouse and click on that OK button. So I can live with that, honestly. There are some, Matt Ullman is actually talking about the SoundForge fade-in bug on file starts. That's actually interesting. Wait a minute, are you on SoundForge on Mac? Yeah, because maybe he's on SoundForge on Mac, because I do know he has a Mac. SoundForge on Mac is crap. I'll just go ahead and say it. SoundForge on Mac is not very good at all. And I'm actually hopeful that that it's going to get a lot better once it moves over into the proper hands over at Magix, because it used to be under the control of Sony, and then Sony sold all their professional audio over to Magix, those guys of Samplitude and all those other products. He's talking about SoundForge only on PC. Actually, I wonder about that fade-in bug on file start. I haven't had that problem, honestly. Although it sounds very familiar. Maybe I've come across it before, but it's been a while. So I don't think I have that problem. I need to think about that now.
A lot of guys, I think in the chat room, the wonderful, Matt Hoffman is still using Logic Pro 9. And it's, it makes me wonder whether the strategy here is basically we release, for example, Logic Pro, the first version of Logic Pro 9 is going to be complete buggy mess. And by the time they get to the very last version of Logic 9, that's when it's finally mature. Is that the approach here? Because, I certainly see, well, what are we up to with Logic? 10.2.3, I think we're at the moment. So when they go up the major numbers, like 10.1 to 10.2, I think we've got Alchemy and we got a whole bunch of really great new features and stuff like that. Now we're on 2.3. Does this mean that by the time we get to 10.2.9, or at least the last version before they do 10.3, that's going to be stable? To me, this seems like beta software. It seems like a release plan for beta software, that the last version is the gold master that you release for sale, and yet this is the version that you get. If you bought Logic today, you would get this, and you would get all of these bugs in it as well. And I just think that maybe it's just me, but because these days it's an interesting. We're getting slightly soft topic here now, so watch out. There's an interesting thing in this modern day where so much of what we do is based in software, and not only, of course, in audio, but in most things that we do. Software takes, even though it's what's the word? Is it amorphous? Like it's intangible. Yeah. We want to feel that kind of sense of the same. We want to have a relationship with the software the same way that we would with a piece of hardware. So with a piece of hardware, you get that sort of you build a sort of a weird bond with this box and knobs and stuff on it. And you sort of, there's that feeling of dependability. I plug it in, I crank it up, and I know it's going to do what it's going to do, and it's going to do it well. And I love this box, and I would never trade it for anything. You want to sort of feel that, that same way towards software. So some software, as a few people in the chat room, a few people, that's you, Vince, Reaper. Just having a quick. Yeah, so like for some people, for example, Reaper, and there's Renoise, and I think Reason is supposed to be quite solid, and a lot of there are those software tools out there that, certainly Renoise. The way I feel about it is like I'm completely shocked when in the third time in 6 or 7 years it crashes. It's like, it crashed. That happens. You build this sort of expectation that it's going to be solid and it's going to be reliable. And I guess when we're doing our work professionally, you need it to be there for you every time and not just crashing all over the place, or with like these weird, odd kind of bugs that just sort of make it feel almost, I hate to say it, but it actually, in the case of Logic, it sort of feels amateur somehow. It sort of feels, did they even properly test this before they release it? Because it's not solid. It just feels flaky. And then when you got that sense of flakiness, you don't view that software anymore as this reliable piece of kit that you can just, like a sturdy hammer that you can just use for decades and just, bang away. That it's dependable. You sort of, I better be careful with Logic. I don't want it to crash. If I do that, then this will happen because that happened last time, and then that will crash that. So I've got to be careful there. And you just don't really want to be thinking about that stuff. So it's kind of a shame. And I don't know if it's just me, because like in the chat room, as Matt Miller and who else, I think there's somebody else, was saying that they have very few problems with Logic Pro X. So maybe it's just me. I don't know, but it's just very disappointing, because otherwise it is such a great program with such a great legacy, and there's like such great value, again, as I said. So I've actually been recently, I downloaded Bitwig again. I had a Bitwig license once, but then I sold it because Bitwig is still a bit immature. It is still a bit immature, but it's a great, it's like the bastard love child of Logic and Ableton, really.
Yeah. Bitwig's only been around for 2 years, maybe less than 2 years.
Yeah, that's right. It does sort of give you that sense of solidness somehow. I've used it pretty much. I've used the demo, and I used it when I had the license, and never any odd issues like these. Sort of glitchy, odd, sort of bad. There's like a smell of bad programming in the air. What is that? Oh, it's Logic. Anyway,
all these programs are just so huge and big, and I wonder I do wonder what it would be like to be a programmer working on this thing, where you have a legacy of code that spans more than a decade. I'm not a Logic guy. I'm mostly a PC guy. And just to continue on the DAW thing for just a little bit more, I use Cakewalk Sonar, and there are a whole lot of problems with Cakewalk Sonar, and they got me. They got me because they just changed their policy less than a month ago, where instead of doing the whole hey, every year do this update thing, or hey, subscribe in order to get maintenance updates and whatnot, they decided to do a lifetime update system. So you buy Sonar Platinum and you get updates for life.
Wow.
And I decided to buy into it. Although there's another part of my brain that says there's no way you're actually going to get the updates that are actually going to fix the issues that you have with Sonar. Like, the tempo marking and matching thing just does not work the way it should. Where, I changed the tempo here. I want to shift these notes over, and suddenly all my notes disappear. It just doesn't like it when I try to do anything where I'm changing tempos in order to match improvisation.
Mm.
Um, the or For me as a video game guy, I like exporting audio, whether music or sound effects, with marker data in it.
Right.
And I would love to put that in the DAW and have it there. Sonar does not support markers in wave export data. When are they going to do that? I don't know if they're going to do that. The more reasonable part of my brain is saying they're not going to do that anytime soon. And then there's the part of my brain that said, oh, but maybe they will. And that helped me decide to spend $99 and do the lifetime updates thing that they just announced a few weeks ago. We will see. I wonder how stupid I am. I wonder.
Is it generally for your average users every day? Is it how often in a week will Sonar crash on you?
It's definitely not once a week. I would say it's more along the lines of maybe even less than once a month. It's very rare that Sonar actually crashes on me. Maybe a few times a year, I would say. But some of these functions just don't work. That's really the most annoying thing. I haven't really had an issue with Sonar just crashing and taking down work with me.
Hmm. Yeah, that's I mean, a lot of to Logic's credit, it does have a robust autosave system. So even though I would say, I mean, on the previous project that I did entirely in Logic, as I said, there was 3 of these head scratching amateurish bugs, and then one full blown flamboyant vanishing crash where it just disappeared in the middle of just working, playing some, thinking up a new idea. Oh, everything stopped. Where did Logic go? And I'm just looking at my desktop thinking, it's like just vanished. But to its credit, yeah, I mean, it does have a robust sort of autosave feature. So, you don't tend to lose anything, but it just doesn't inspire confidence. Speaking of inspiring confidence, while we're here in this gap between our tools and our technique discussion today, let's have a quick mention of our fantastic sponsor, iZotope. Now, there is some rock-solid software for you.
That is true, actually. iZotope has... Yeah, I don't think iZotope RX has ever crashed on me. Yeah, actually, I'm pretty sure. It has never crashed on me, and I've used it for a few years, and it's been always rock solid for me. It is pretty fantastic.
I think that it is also thanks to... I mean, plugins generally tend to be fairly robust.
Yeah, that's true. But it's not just the plugin versions. I also use the standalone. So I'll send audio. I'll send audio across in from SoundForge or from Sonar, and it's great. I'll just use the standalone version of the RX audio editor, and it works great.
Mm. Yeah, iZotope, they do have a knack for creating those things that feel like a dependable tool that you can come back to, as thousands and thousands of people do. Anyway, so today, being just Vince and I, we thought we would dive deep into some heavy philosophical technique discussion. Let's start with talking a little bit about. Let's have a look through these ideas that we had. Suspension of disbelief for sonic realism.
Now that is a phrase.
Suspension of disbelief for sonic realism. Yeah, so basically, what does that mean? It means how to make a sound which is convincing, but not realistic, however, completely suitable for the context, for the application in the game. So it may not be realistic, meaning it may not comprise of real sound. It may not comprise of actual sound for what it is that you're doing. For example, a footstep might be created by, punching a watermelon instead of actually taking a boot on some gravel. But this kind of suspension of disbelief for sonic realism. My question is, why does this happen? Why does this happen? Because to me, it's an odd human thing. And I think that with sound, it's a bit easier to do it than it is with something visual. I mean, you can take a square, you draw a square on a piece of paper and say, here's the sun, for example, right? There's part of your brain that I guess the threshold is much lower, no, higher for that suspension of disbelief when it comes to something visual. For whatever reason, with audio cues, maybe it's because in a game they're usually matched up with something visual. Maybe that's what the key is. But when you play a lot of those old classic retro games where they are severely limited by the technology with what they can do as far as sound effects are concerned, basically like a modulated a square wave that goes like that. Oh, I've just fallen down somewhere, or oh, I've just sort of leveled up, or oh, something just fell over.
Mhm.
Is it sort of a conditioned thing that a lot of us in game audio now, at least in our age bracket, have come through that path with those early games, and so to us, like with a square wave sounds like maybe a footstep or something falling over. Is that because we're conditioned, or is there something special about sound and visual cues? Or what do you think, Vince?
I think there's a lot of things that could go into it. The first thing that came to mind for me is that we're really bad at hearing things. Like we just are. In terms of our ability to hear things, uh, we can recognize that something is there. We can hear things, but we're not very good at actually diving into the details of that. I could not draw out that waveform that is actually hitting my ears. I couldn't like it takes a really large amount of training to be able to listen to something and say, hey, that actually has a lot of energy over at around 5K, 12K, and there's a really big bump at 80 hertz, and it's definitely 80 hertz and not 60 hertz and not 100 hertz, right? It actually takes a lot of training to figure that out. We're not naturally adept at that.
Mm.
But then in addition to that, it's the fact that audio is actually used for so much and we can accept it for what it's trying to do. And by that, I mean, there's some audio that's made to be experienced and felt. And then there's some audio that's made to distinctly tell the listener something specific.
Mm.
The divide between sound that is embodied and sound that encodes information in it. And it's not just games, but everything has this gradient that it actually not gradient, this gamut that it actually spans from embodied to encoded. I'm out in the world and I hear something and I don't feel that sound. I actually connect directly to the thing that is being communicated there. And it could be, oh, a subway door is closing. And I'm thinking more about a subway door closing, that concept, than the actual sound that signals that the subway door is closing, versus an explosion and the feeling of that explosion. And in games, sometimes we actually care a lot about the realism of it and the feeling of it, because the feeling is what is being communicated to the player in and of itself, versus the information that's connected to it. So that little sine wave or square wave chirp that signals a step. Well, actually, it's important that it's a step or falling down a cliff or whatnot, and we connect with that concept more than we connect with the sound.
I see. So does that mean that if in the case where there is no visual cue, like for example, something that is coming outside of the player's field of awareness in the game, unseen sound, so to speak, sounds of unseen elements in the game, does that mean that if there is going to be a necessity for things that are that need to cue an awareness of something that you can't actually see, does that increase the importance of sonic realism in that case, do you think?
I'm not sure about that, actually. I think that... let me think about that. I mean, there's... Wow. I mean, it's it's actually really tough. I'm just sort of imagining myself out in the real world, just away from games. I don't have anything on my head projecting any sound at me. I'm not doing any sort of augmented reality. I'm just imagining all the different types of sounds that can come up. And I don't know actually. I'm actually thinking now about the future and what sonic realism actually will mean as we keep on going, because there's so much that is what we might consider synthetic out in the world now compared to a few decades ago or a few centuries ago. Everything is synthesizing sounds. I remember, let's see, I was in my car recently, and I've had this car for a few months. Actually, it's a brand new car, and I was coming to grips with the realization that the turn signal sound is synthesized or a sample. It was not actually the sound of a mechanism that was clicking on and off like I had in my previous car. And that actually really, really freaked me out when I thought about that. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is totally not real in the traditional sense. And we're going to have much more of that in the future. And I'm just thinking, wow, what else is out there that I've been always assuming is real, but is actually not real at all, whether it be a recorded representation playing over speakers or synthesized. And I think, man, there must be something more. And I'm actually just questioning sonic realism in general.
Let me share a little interesting experience that I had with a Vitae backroom game, which we had done for Sony, called the Modern Zombie Taxi Company. With this game, when I first started doing the sound 2 years ago, I thought that I wanted to experiment with the idea of setting imposed limitations on a workflow to see what would happen. And the imposed limitation that I set was that I'm going to make all of the sounds for this very large scale VR game entirely synthesized. But the reason that I did that is that I wanted to make sure that the sound had some connection with what you were seeing visually. Now, visually, it's sort of a low poly kind of look. So I thought that was interesting. Low poly kind of look. Semi-real, it sort of looks real. You have no trouble at all making that connection between what you see and what you are familiar with from real life, because things have a recognizable shape and a form, but it's low poly. So it's obviously highly stylized, and visually, it just doesn't look real, but you have no trouble at all understanding this is a car, that is, a street sign, that is a person, right? So I was thinking, okay, how can I, as an interesting experiment, how can I transfer that concept across into audio? The solution that I came up with, which led to an interesting result, which I want to share, is that, all right, I will try and synthesize all of the sounds. However, like the visual style, even though it's synthetic, I guess you could call it, in the sense that it's not photorealistic, but it's sort of low poly, like that is synthetic, I will make the sounds straddling that same kind of middle ground between real and recognizable, however clearly not actual real world sound. So I was sort of intentionally going for sort of that uncanny valley kind of area between something that's completely real or something that sounds very, very real, but it's clearly not real. So I thought the easiest way to do that is just to synthesize all of the sounds, but put in a lot of effort to making sure that these synthesized sound effects sound as real as I can make them, and have the synthesizers bring those limitations so that it's not totally real, but just sort of one step back from that, like the low poly look that I was seeing. That's the way that I interpreted that low poly look anyway. So over 2 years, I went through this whole project, and a lot of sounds. This is a big game, and a big world, and there's a lot of sounds, and I was synthesizing all manner, garage doors and car doors, and can you hear me? What? Vince said I got robot voice.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. It's appropriate.
That happens every now and then. Anyway, let me know if that happens again. So anyway, you've got all these different kinds of impact sounds of objects hitting the ground. You've got different materials. You've got metals. You've got wood. You've got stone. You've got what else? Anyway, all manner of, there was a steam train in there, and there were the sounds of creaking gates and all manner of stuff, right? Everybody seems in the chat room is now responding to my Borg voice just there. You can thank the broadband between Japan and the US for that. I think that the Pacific Ocean just got a little bit more heavy for a moment. What I found at the end of all of that, okay, to a certain extent, it was a bit kind of is hedonistic the word? No, just like purely for self-enjoyment, because I like synthesizers.
Self-indulgent.
Self-indulgent, that's it. Not hedonistic. Because I like synthesizing sound, and I like that challenge. Okay, I need to make a car door, like the sound of a car door slamming closed. How do I do that? Well, let's break it down into acoustic basics. So you have this big metal sheet, which resonates like this, and metal resonates in a certain way, which has, these kinds of high frequencies that do this, but very, very, because it's very tight and it resonates, it vibrates with very small movements. That will produce a certain kind of overtone, and then you've got the muffling of the inner wall of the car, but then you're hearing it from inside the car, which will also impart a certain kind of sound. And okay, so now that I've broken the sound down using these synthesizers that I have, how do I put that together? Anyway, so it was great fun. What I found at the end of all of that, and this might be relevant to anybody who's interested in pursuing this technique for another game project, is that personally, I found that it did not really work. So I felt that I achieved the goal that I was trying to go for at the end of it. I felt that, yes, I've made a game with entirely synthesized sounds that sound almost real, but not quite, intentionally. So I did that. However, even though I succeeded in the goal, was the goal itself something that was, beneficial for the player in terms of their enjoyment and their involvement in the game? And the answer that I came to is that no, not really. Now, is this it? Of course, it could be because my sounds were shit. I don't think so, because I don't think they were that bad, because I did put a lot of effort into them. And
I thought they actually sounded good.
They sounded like what I wanted them to sound like, which is like almost real, but one step back from that. But at the end of all of that, yeah, was it worth it? Interestingly enough, for all the people that played the game, the overall response was, wow. Very thankfully, a lot of people said, "Oh, I love your music, Alex. Great." Nobody said anything about the sound ever. Like, nobody said, "Oh, I really like it when you do that and you hear this," or that sound that you have there sounds really good. Nobody ever said anything about the sound. The only comments I got about the sound was, kind of sounds a bit flat, like a bit sort of dull.
Dull.
Obviously. So I had a system in there which I called the free adjusting response transient, otherwise known as the fart system. The fart system was where I took a tiny little transient, and I put that on most of the impact sounds, and that the amount of that transient that comes in is controlled by an RTPC through wires. So the stronger the impact, the more kind of click that you'll get on the impact sounds. I did that. I also had there was another one which was with an abbreviation BUM, which I've forgotten. The bi-unilateral mediating sound something or other. Anyway, I was doing all these kind of funny tricks and bits and pieces in there to try and sort of spice it up a little bit so that people wouldn't say that it would sound kind of dull. It was punchy. I guess it was fairly well mixed. Fairly well. But, I would sort of agree with people when people say it kind of sounds kind of dull. And myself as well, when I played it, after all that work, sort of, yeah, you drive a car, you slam the door. It sounds like a door slamming, but, it's not anything really exciting. You drive along, you hit stuff in the car, and you get sounds that you would sort of recognize as what you would expect from driving into stuff. But I think for me, what I learned at the end of that is that goal of semi-realistic, almost realistic sound. The problem was that on the one side, there is no sense of satisfaction and connection between what you are seeing visually and something very real that you're hearing. When you drive into a wall and you hear the sound of a car crumpling, if it sounds extremely real, but it doesn't look that real, that gap is really sort of entertaining. It's fun, and it adds that extra element of depth to that experience. On the other hand, if you drive into a wall and you get this sort of odd square wavy retro sound like this to sort of simulate the sound of a crashing car, then now there's that sort of layer of entertainment there for you. And it's like, oh, it looked like I crashed into a wall, but it didn't sound like it. But that combination of the two and that contrast between the two was kind of fun and entertaining and interesting. In this case, because you drive into a wall, it sort of sounds like it, but not quite. There's nothing for the brain to do except sort of feel a bit, oh, I guess I just drove into a wall. It sort of sounded like that. I mean, not 100% like that, but more or less like that. So there's like no aspect of entertainment there for the brain to enjoy, unlike something that doesn't sound anything like it looks like, or something that sounds more realistic than what it looks like. So that experience got me thinking, which is why I was wanting to get your opinion, Vince, and also the opinion of our viewers. Is this just what happens when you try to go for almost real? And does that mean that uncanny valley, I mean, I did it as an experiment, but does this prove that maybe that uncanny valley of sonic realism is not that useful for us?
Man, yeah, I do feel like there is something useful about when the sound is when there is a discrepancy between what the sound is communicating and what's going on visually. When I'm working with a lot of guys for various games, it always seems like they want the sound to work harder than what the visuals are doing. There's only so much that the visuals can do, and you are doing that with your, in VR with this sort of polygonal, flat shaded sort of look. And a lot of games that I've worked on, they're not quite real. They're sort of stylized, or either 2D or 3D, non-photorealistic, or something like that. And they want the sound to be more real than what's being depicted on screen, hyper real. Oh, if you're crashing into something, then we're not doing it visually, but we want the sound to communicate stuff about the debris that is still floating about you, fluttering to the ground so many seconds after that initial impact.
Right.
And we're okay with that as listeners. It's like, okay, we expect the sound to keep on telling us stuff even after everything else has settled in front of our eyes.
Yeah, I think hyperreal is a good description, because you notice in Hollywood movies, when you watch, like the classic easy to understand example is, in fight scenes in Hollywood movies, the sound of a punch is like so unrealistic. It's sort of like a distorted snare drum, and yet it's what you want it to sound like, even though that's, if you actually, God forbid you actually have the experience of hearing what it sounds like to have somebody's face punched at close proximity, that I imagine it doesn't sound anything like a distorted snare drum like it sounds like in the Hollywood movies. And yet when you're watching that, you want it to sound like that. You want it to sort of sound over dramatic and over sort of exaggerated real, like hyper real, as you said. So that is, I guess that explains one reason perhaps why the expectation for non-audio people, especially in game development and possibly for players too, is that they want hyper-realism. They want it to sound more real. In that case, why is it that it works so well when you go way over the other end of the scale? When you go way back onto the sort of the extreme primitive sound, like just square waves, or or even musical cues for sound. The Bugs Bunny show is a fantastic example of that. A lot of those sound effects they do with the orchestra, fantastic. It's way on the other end of the scale. That is just as entertaining as hyper real. That middle ground is, at least what I found in my experience, was not really a goal worth striving so hard for. But why is it then that the flip side of hyper real works so real, hyper unreal. How come that works? Is it just conditioning?
I think, well, sometimes those musical sounds, especially, are so nice in and of itself. Hey, that sounds nice. That's a nice chord. Hey, that E power chord. It just sounds good when you listen to it, and sometimes the sound that might be more representative or matches. Uh, it just okay. It's a sound. There's all this stuff that's in there, but it's not coherent, and we like that musical coherence.
Mm.
I'm not sure if it is conditioning, honestly. Matt Ullman just said, yeah, it is conditioning, but I'm actually not certain of that. I want to say that there is something very nice about having something that is easily understood. So when you have things that is musically coherent, that allows you to get quicker to what is being connected. So okay, let's say you got a punch sound. I was working on punch sounds for a couple of games, and punch sounds can be all sorts of stuff. They can be big, they can be small. Usually they're really, really noisy, and those punch sounds have to communicate something specifically, because it's never just a punch sound. Punch sounds in video games don't work the same way that they do in movies, where they have to be big and huge and awesome. They have to fall into a system, and then people who are playing a game and experiencing those punch sounds have to connect to the system that the player is going to develop virtuosity in. So often that means that we want our punch sounds to actually be simpler and allow the player to connect more easily to the system that of punch sounds. Typically that means something like light, medium, strong, initial hit versus combo hit versus counter hit. Um, and being able to connect to that system, that is perhaps a greater uh, joy, an even more satisfying experience for the player, because he's going through some learning there, as opposed to just merely listening to something that's enjoyable.
Mm. Yeah, I see. The AKA has he said that I keep on using the word entertaining. And it's interesting, Matt Ullman comments that we don't want to be challenged by our entertainment. We want escape, but we want it in parameters that reinforce aesthetics and beliefs that we bring. The idea of like challenging entertaining, that's fascinating to me. That sort of if you take that as being you are somehow intellectually challenged during your entertainment experience. So, like I said, the idea, if we break it up into realism, if we break it up into three groups, hyper unreal and yet obviously suggestive, obvious being within the context of whether it's conditioning or whether it's, other kinds of reasons. Then you have this middle funny ground, which I've been talking about, which is sort of almost real. Then you have over real, like hyper real. So most game audio fits into these extremities on either end. And that middle ground, which I was experimenting, which didn't work out so well, to me would seem like, of those three options, the one that is the least intellectually challenging, because there's no necessity for interpretation or connection with what you're looking at. It's just, I guess if it's hyper real, I suppose when you get to the hyper real area, then you're able to sort of take it on an emotional level, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But then you would wonder that, like the hyper unreal side of things, you would think that would be somehow intellectually challenging. That the sound of two square wave notes did it like that. Something has fallen over. That interpretive process, is that not somehow intellectually challenging?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that when you have the hyper unreal, or we could or maybe we could just say cartoony sort of sound or musical sounds, they can actually be more intellectually stimulating because it's more explicit what the possible intellectual connection is.
Mm.
When you go into the hyperreal, uh, just starting from reality, we understand, I think, instinctually that there is a lot of stuff out there that is in the world that we cannot possibly parse.
Right.
And it can't really meaningfully connect to anything within any sort of system that we can learn.
Mm.
And we go into hyper reality in some video games. It's like, oh, there's all this stuff that's in there in order to create further reality or further verisimilitude. And we can keep on listening to those things, but we can't connect them to anything that's going on in the system. It's just made to sound more and more real, but it doesn't actually create any sort of learning. There's nothing to learn from it. So it's actually not intellectual there.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
it's tough. I've actually thought that that it could be interesting if you can make something that is extremely realistic, that does have a strong mapping to the things that are going on in a system that you are playing around in.
Mm.
But it's so difficult to do that. It's so difficult to make sounds that are incredibly realistic, incredibly that have just this wonderful feel to them, while also creating a clean mapping between the necessarily simplified systems that players interact with.
Mm. It's a little ironic, isn't it, that in order to achieve hyperrealism in sound, we're often resorting to layering together completely unrelated sounds in order to get, in order to get that sort of hyper-real sort of sonic experience. It's a little ironic that, the ingredients for that is usually things that are completely what you wouldn't expect. Anyway,
I had some fun with I just want to say I had some fun recently with grinding metal and squealing pigs with this vault door that was opening. It was kind of fun, but it worked great.
Yeah, it's it is curious though that the generally the hyperreal is what people, non-audio people and possibly players as well will want, and if you don't do that, then it's the other. Oh wow, man, it sounds really retro. It is curious that just plain realism will just have people saying, well, it kind of sounds kind of boring. I guess it sounds all right. I'd be if anybody's interested to continue a discussion about this, or if you have any game projects that you're working on where you're trying to do what I did on that project with making a whole game library full of pseudo almost real sounds, then let me know. Get in touch, because it's an interesting sort of discussion for me, and I'm curious about how much of it was my own execution of my objective and how much of it was whether or not that objective was actually worthwhile to begin with, because it just occurs to me that everybody expects hyper-real sounds. Why should sound have to be hyper-realistic, and not sound retro? Surely there are other options available to us, and that was, I guess, what that project was trying to experiment with. Interesting discussion, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it was a very worthy experiment, and I'm always interested in just different things sounding differently. There's a lot of games that, quite honestly, sound the same. And it would be nice to actually hear some different types of approaches to sound, and not just in the sense of, oh, what if this realistic game sounded more cartoony, or this cartoony game sounded more realistic. There's a lot of different spaces for exploration, and I think the approach that you did was actually a really cool approach, and I think that there would be I think the whole industry would be even better served if other people kept on running with that idea.
It'd be interesting to see what would happen with this idea of like almost real synthesized sound if the visuals were photorealistic. I'm wondering now whether that would whether that would somehow add something to that sonic experience, if that now there is no visual interpretation required on an intellectual level because it looks photorealistic. However, at least in our case, because there was like a visual interpretation required, and then there's this audio interpretation required. It doesn't intend to connect directly with an emotional level. It's not sort of hyper exaggerated, real, reflecting how you want to feel when you see a certain event through the sound. It wasn't that. So maybe mixing these two necessities for interpretation, maybe that was my mistake. Maybe if it was on a photorealistic setting where you don't need to interpret anything, maybe that might have worked a little better. I think I'm always really interested in how we can not only try out different approaches, but also try different approaches that complement what the game is doing visually in different ways. Because artists spend, the wonderful artists that we privileged to work with in all of our teams, they spend a long time deciding, okay, so like what extent of realism we're going to go for, what's our sort of overall aesthetic, our visual approach, how are we going to do it. And so I think from our point of view, as audio people as well, we should be doing the same things, not just, oh yeah, I'm going to, pull out Reaper and pull out some Sound Toys plugins and like slap in this and slap in that and get like the most gory sounding punch you've ever heard with like grapefruits and punching like hanging pigs in a butchery shop, but to what extent do we want to have realism, and how do we use that to our advantage? The different directions that we have as far as hyper real, almost real, obviously unreal, these different directions, how can we use these? I think that our art craft deserves the same discussion that our colleagues in the visual arts field put into the game development that we do. So, yes. Interesting. Thanks everybody for joining Vince and I through this journey into sound and philosophy and other wanky, pretentious, bullshitty kind of stuff. It's a good thing, every now and then. It's a healthy thing.
I think I want to say that it's appropriate for this episode, because 107 is a prime number. I think there's something to this. The next prime number, by the way, is 109.
Right. That's actually fitting, because I don't think we're going to be having a show next week, right?
Yeah. So
next week is
July 4th.
July 4th. What are you doing on July 4th?
Mostly eat hot dogs. I like hot dogs. Except I don't really. I mean, if you think about it, a hot dog versus, I don't know, real meat, steak, chicken, fish, whatever. But why do we choose to eat hot dogs? I don't know. But on that day, I got to say, whatever. Hot dogs, I guess if I put enough mustard on it, it's pretty tasty.
Is this like a standard American tradition, hot dogs on July 4th?
It is totally a standard tradition. It is one of those things. You have a grill there that everyone calls a barbecue, but it's not a barbecue if you're just grilling. It's grilling, and you're grilling hot dogs. There's no smoke involved. So it's not barbecue, guys. It's grilling, and everyone grills hot dogs.
Do you have in the States? Do you have hot dog buns that have like a hole in the middle instead of like instead of opening like a V? It's actually like a cylinder.
There's actually no. We don't have that. Although there are different types of hot dog buns throughout America. Like if you go to the Northeast, you have split top buns, and it's a subtle distinction. The cut is on the top versus on the side, and it really does change the hot dog experience. Let me tell you.
The hot dog experience. Are we going for hyper real, or like, is there any intellectual interpretation required when you chew on this hot dog?
Oh yeah, it's I don't know. Honestly, intellectual and hot dog is the least. I just can't imagine this unless you're talking about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle or something.
Or you're talking about you're talking about the etymology. Like, why is this thing called a hot dog? that's a story for another day and another podcast about another topic, because you've been watching the Game Audio Hour. 107, the prime number, the non-Roland number. It's been a pleasure, Vince and I. We won't be with you next week. However, week after that, hopefully we should be back on air with the illustrious Kyle Johnson and the wonderful Michael Gordon Shapiro. So, in closing, thank you for watching. This is Game Audio Hour. Please follow us on Game Audio Hour everywhere, on every social network you can possibly imagine, except Snapchat.
Orkut.
What?
Orkut.
Yeah, LO.
Yeah.
What's the other one? Diaspora. Let's go through a list of like dead social networks right now.
Yeah, bookmark our MySpace.
MySpace. There we go. All right. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Yo.